Ex-racist people of Reddit, what changed your views? When I was wounded in Iraq, two white guys stepped over me. One literally stepped on my back to get themselves to a safer place. A black guy picked me up like I was a child, carried me to safety, and held my hand until a medic got there. Man, I don't even know where to start with this one. I grew up in the middle of effing nowhere, Mississippi, where the slave trade was referred to as the Great African Migration in our history books. Every person of color was referred to by the N-word as just the default. It wasn't until I moved the F out of the South that I began to comprehend what racism was. I wish I could say I had a moment of clarity that washed away all the racist bullshit that I'd grown up with, but it was more like a couple decades worth of mental deprogramming I had to fight against. There was so much underlying hate of different people that warped how my view of the world was. The Great African Migration just buried that particular bit of history under a refined mountain of sugar. WTF? I mean, as a foreigner, I'm under the impression that burying everything, including food, under a mountain of sugar is the American standard practice. Great African Migration. I thought I heard it all, but took the cake and swallowed it whole in one sitting, unfortunately. Not me, but my best friend's parents. They told her not to touch me because she would get my skin disease. I'm a brownie, and at the time we met I was 12. They didn't want us to be friends, but I would always be kind and polite to them, full well knowing how they felt about my skin color. One year my friend, at this point best friend, was having a sleepover birthday party and her parents said I could come, but couldn't sleep over. My friend cancelled her party and her parents must have felt like complete sh because they started to talk to me more and more after that. We have been best friends for almost 30 years now. Her parents came to my wedding. They send me a Christmas card every year. They call me and ask how I'm doing, and they invite me to their get-togethers. I'm glad they came around and I'm proud of them. Your best friend is a champ. For real. IDK how old they were at the time, but that's a pretty effing gutsy move for a kid. Props to them for standing up for their friend at the expense of their own party. Damn. This is the first comment in the thread to make me tear up. Your emotional maturity from such a young age and their change of perspective inspires a lot of hope. Not me, but my grandpa told me that when he was young he was a bit racist, due to his a-hole alcoholic dad being really racist and teaching him to treat others of different races like trash. He told me this stopped though when he was around 13 when his dad left. He realized how stupid it was to judge others based on race, and I'm glad he realized how stupid it was since he's a really sweet guy now. My grandparents used to tell me about my grandpa's evolution when it came to racism. My grandma was born and raised in California. Her best friend in high school was a black girl named Sonia, and if memory serves, her parents also had black friends as well, and her father was born and raised in Louisiana. My grandfather was from Georgia. One time while he was still courting my grandma, she said they were talking on the sidewalk and black couple was walking on the same sidewalk, coming towards them. Grandma thought nothing of it. Grandpa apparently shoved her behind him and shouted, "Get on the other side of the road, you." Grandma was horrified. I don't know the details, but by the time my mom was born and in school, my grandparents were really good friends with a black couple who owned a bar that people of color frequented. My mom would tell me that more often than not, she and her brother and my grandparents would be the only white people around. The owners were even hosting a wedding one time, or one of their children was getting married, and the caterers backed out or flaked out for some reason. My grandparents and mom were invited as friends, but they ended up catering so that the family didn't have to worry about anything. By the time I came along, my grandpa was a totally different person, and while he never told me what helped him change his mind, I still liked hearing the story and the subsequent stories that showed his evolution. This is sorta like my dad. I don't mean to make excuses for him, but my grandfather, Papa I called him, grew up in rural India and didn't see a black man until he was in his late 20s. He had been exposed to the words of other racists, and never heard anything opposing those thoughts, and never saw another black man where he could form his own opinion. When my dad was growing up, they were watching football and my dad asked why there weren't any black quarterbacks, and my papa said because they're too stupid to be quarterback. They literally just don't have enough brain cells. My dad lived with that information for a very long time, with that outlook, until he joined the Air Force and finally met black people who completely changed his opinion. It helps that my father is an extremely intelligent and widely open-minded person. I don't think many other people would be able to work themselves out of thoughts like that which they've grown their entire lives with. Sadly, that was a widely propagated narrative that was still alive and well, broadly, into the late 80s and early 90s. Rush Limbaugh, may he burn in absolute hell, made a flippant comment in 2003 alluding to the intelligence of black QBs, while on ESPN, as a black physics major, and now astronomer, from the goddamn hood. That sure always made me feel some type of way. I'm glad your dad saw the light. That's a hard narrative to dispel. Being born and raised in the South, we're often seen as the good ones, which is crazy to me. Thanks for sharing. As a lurker, this is a thread I can contribute to. From birth I was raised to be racist in a racist household. VA. I was ignorant. I use the N-word, anti-Semitic, homophobic, racist language every day. My immediate family and extended family all share the same ignorance. At family gatherings, if one of my older cousins let slip they were dating someone new, the first question would be, is he white? Followed by laughter. But the question was serious. Then I started middle school, 6th grade. On the first day of class I set down my backpack against the classroom wall, like every other student, while we found our desks and had a small meet greet new classmates. I made sure to only speak to the kids, white, whom I knew from elementary school. Our teacher told us to take our seats. I'm 42 years old and I remember this like it was yesterday. I picked up my backpack, found my desk. Before I could open my bag, the girl behind me told me she liked my earrings. Her mom wouldn't let her get her ears pierced until high school. Then I heard another voice from further behind me say, "MK, this isn't my backpack." The backpack sitting on this girl's desk was identical to the one sitting next to my desk. We both opened our backpacks and realized we'd grabbed the wrong bag. Internally I rolled my eyes in disgust. This girl was a N, but I was taught to never let it show. So we met each other to quickly exchange. Her smile was beautiful. She wore glasses the same shape as mine. She wore her hair in a ponytail, just like mine. In our back to school shopping we picked the exact same backpack and we picked the exact same Nikes. Pink white. Her name was Jacinda. I found myself genuinely smiling back to her, and giggling like young girls do. That day she asked to sit together during lunch, and we sat beside each other for lunch every single day of middle school. She was my very first best friend. Jacinda taught me about her Sunday school classes. My family never attended church. We talked about everything important in the life of middle school girls. She wasn't allowed to attend my birthday parties, and I wasn't allowed to go to hers, but we always celebrated together at school. I loved her so much. When it was time to go to high school I continued in public school and her parents chose to homeschool her. I thought homeschooling was the coolest idea. Jacinda is brilliantly intelligent. God, she was going to do great things for this world. Long before the age of social media, we lost touch sadly, but I still think of her often. After meeting Jacinda I never used another racist or derogatory word. Meeting Jacinda changed my life for the better. I hope one day you and Jacinda are able to reconnect. I legit thought this would end with something like we are celebrating 10 years next month and expecting our ex-kid. His name? Albert Einstein. Brother was racist. We both love science fiction. One time he was talking about all the cool races in the Star Wars and Star Trek and Mass Effect universes. How creative Lucas and Roddenberry were. He talked about how great it would be to be among those races as a human and acquaint yourself with alien cultures and people and mythology. I said, you can't even mingle with the other races on your home planet. Maybe it was the weed, but what I said had some effect on him. He's very noticeably more tolerant and curious about other people's now. I think he realized that his previous philosophies were not in line with those of the Federation. Good for him. I've always found it weird that there are people who enjoy Star Trek but are also intolerant. Star Trek is so blatantly anti-intolerance I just don't see how they could enjoy it. This is the one I love most in the thread. Such a simple truth you pointed out to him and so effective. He was probably like inside his head when you said that because it was one of those, wow, there, dark not wrong moments. I had one when I was complaining to a friend about nearly freezing to death when I got drunk and decided to walk home in just a shirt in sub-zero temperatures. You know, you don't have to drink. You can just not drink. What a great story. Fighting Racism with Cannabis and Sifi. You should read Perdido Street Station by China Miéville if you like the interesting races from Star Trek. BTW. A guy I worked with said he was neo-Nazi as a teenager and ended up in prison somehow. He hated Jews for some reason, and blacks. He was never clear on why, just that he had so much hatred in his heart, and that was his outlet. He was in prison for many years. I think he almost killed somebody by beating them up. So, many years later and in prison there was a mentor type staff there, and this one lady was so helpful to him, and she cared about him so much that it really started to get into his head the idea of being a positive person. Then, he learned that she was Jewish, and he said he couldn't believe she was so kind and caring despite the fact he was a claimed neo-Nazi. From that day he swore to be a better person. He learned his lesson. He's a pretty great guy these days, doing his family thing and making sure his son grows up with lots of love and all that he didn't have. Really remarkable. Great guy. At first I thought you were just typing out the plot of American History X. A lot of the neo-Nazi and white supremacy groups target children, teens in tough environments, give them a place where they feel accepted, and slowly turn up the hate. It's a truly tragic occurrence. My dad would make disparaging remarks about black people, Mexicans, Chinese people, etc. when I was a kid. I remember repeating those same sentiments and no one ever corrected me. In first grade, we were all assigned pen pals from a school in another city and mine was a black girl named Chardonnay. I thought she had a weird name and I was disappointed when I found out she wasn't white. Very soon after that, we learned some very basic info about the civil rights movement during Black History Month. Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, separate water fountains, segregated schools, stuff like that. After that, I felt really bad about being racist and wanting a different pen pal, and really ashamed of my dad and grandparents for thinking that way, and I was so mad that they'd taught me to think that way. After that, I was really happy to have the opportunity to write to my pen pal and get to know her better. I'm so thankful that my school started teaching us about racism early on. It's scary to think how I could have ended up if those sentiments had gone unchecked. I don't think it's unreasonable to expect Chardonnay to be a nice white. Sorry I had to. I once saw a wine magazine write about Oregon's wonderful whites. Seems they took it off the internet since. I wasn't allowed to dance with a black boy in kindergarten. I thought it was stupid and I was so embarrassed. Even as a child it made no sense. I always hoped he had no idea what happened because it hurt my heart and I always thought he was cool. Learning about people by talking to them instead of listening to what my family had to say about them. Exposure is deadly to prejudice most of the time. I wouldn't say most of the time, but it's an extremely helpful tool. I say that because there's no shortage of people who are exposed to other people and still maintain racist views whether they know it or not. Some racists might even use this exposure as proof that they couldn't possibly be racist if they like the specific individuals they were exposed to, no matter how many other racist things they do or say or feel about large groups of people. I guess what I'm saying is that exposure is the first step, not the last one. 3. My grandma grew up in Virginia in the 1900s. Being racist is just the default setting. Nana loved her family more than anything, though, so at one point in the late 1980s, she met her first not 100% white grandkid, and discovered she still loved him. She made astounding late life progress accepting that darker skin toned people were not only people, but family, friends and welcome in her house. All of my grandparents and great grandparents were born in Essie, Georgia, USA. Among the 5 that I knew, 4 grands and a great grandmother, they had a combined total of 34 years of formal education. Only my maternal grandmother finished high school. The educated grandmother was the only one that I ever heard use the N-word. Granny and grandpa and grandma and granddaddy would have killed me dead if they'd heard me use that word. Grandmother was just straight trash. And her mother, Granny, despaired that she'd raised such a person. Grandma was probably the closest thing I had to a fun grandparent, and her rule was I've never disliked anyone who makes music and dances. We usually attended the black church closest to her house when I was with her. Grandma, 1902 to 1997, liked the music there better than at her church. It was lovely. My grandmother, may she rot in hell, was born in 1900 and met her first non-white great-grandchild in the mid-80s. My niece, Told my sister to get that in out of my house. Never spoke to her again. She died later that year. Country bumpkins in Pennsylvania. Could have been easily mistaken for someone below the Mason-Dixon line. Racism is alive and well up north, behind closed doors. I moved away from my one-horse hometown and got away from my extremely prejudiced family. I didn't realize I was racist and being raised in a racist household until 4th grade. I was in a group project having to give a presentation to the class. My group was me and 2 black girls. My parents hated black women. Black people in general, but especially black women. As they both watched tennis, you can guess all the sh they said about the Williams sisters. Meanwhile, there I was standing there watching my group mates talk. They were just as good, if not better than me, at talking in the class, or understanding the material, or anything really. I can still see that moment where the class fades away in my mind and one of my group mates is talking to the class, where I realize a fundamental truth. My parents were wrong. It still makes me sad thinking about stuff I remember saying as a kid, regurgitating things I heard my parents or relatives say. But in my experience, as I have gotten older, is that the #1 way to combat racism is to bring people into the same room. When people have shared experiences, that sense of otherness fades away. Of course, in 2021 and the internet bring what it is, it's really easy for people to hide in their own corners of the internet. But I'm thankful for that experience in 4th grade. I got in trouble a lot over the years for getting mad when family would throw around the N-word or lock their doors when they saw black people. But I knew I was right, and in the decades that have passed, nothing has tarnished or taken away that childhood lesson. The army forced me to live with black people. Turns out I didn't hate anyone. I was just afraid of what I didn't understand and had some very stupid notions passed on to me from my dad and his dipsh friends. I will forever be grateful for the opportunity to understand a greater sample of people than my tiny hometown afforded me. My grandpa said he gained a lifetime of respect for black people after WW2 because they were the most fearless, focused and professional people he had ever seen. Conversely, he hated Orientals for the rest of his life because of his experience fighting the Japanese. His plane was shot down over the Pacific and he was tortured by the Japanese before being rescued by the Navy. I tried to explain to him multiple times that 1. Not all Asians are Japanese, and 2. Not all Japanese people were bad in the first place, but he never came around. My grandfather was the opposite when it came to the Japanese. When he was sent to fight in WW2, he hated them. He had heard all the stories of everything they had done and were doing, so he despised them. Until one day after a battle, when they were collecting the belongings of the Japanese soldiers who had been killed, they collected personal belongings to give to the Red Cross so they could be returned to the fallen soldiers' families. My grandfather opened the wallet of a soldier he had shot and saw a photograph of the young soldier, his wife, and newborn child. My grandfather said he never felt the same about the Japanese after that, and that he thought about that young soldier almost every day since. This is my dad's answer. He told me he was raised racist by racists who didn't understand, I guess as a way to soften the blow of saying his parents were racists. Anyway, then he went to Vietnam, and said the black guys in his unit missed their girlfriends and mothers the same as he did, and got scared and angry the same as he did, and bled the same as he did. That was the beginning of him realizing we were all pretty much the same. You know, overall I would have to say that my experience in the military was a negative one, for all sorts of reasons that are pointless to get into here. But one thing they did right stuck with me. There was some knucklehead boot that put up a bunch of Confederate bullshit in his barracks room. A couple of his roommates just sheepishly dealt with it, or moved requested transfers, but eventually someone spoke up. The Master Chief of the whole base went into the kid's room, tore down all his bullshit and dragged him off, and no one ever saw him again. Do they not realize that the Confederacy were the ones who literally betrayed and fought against the United States military, which they are now part of? My dad was racist. I was raised in a toxic environment, and I guess some of his ideologies rubbed off on me. He was also violent when alcohol was involved, which was a lot of the time. Police would often arrest him to just get him in a cell for the night for being disorderly. On one occasion, the police turned up. One of them came into my room and sat with me as they dealt with my dad. He asked how I was, who I could talk to, etc. He was from a South Asian background. He was very kind to me and did his best in calming me down and giving me advice on dealing with this stuff. I was only about 15 at the time. As they were pulling my dad out, that same police officer was attacked by my dad after breaking free from another officer, breaking the officer's finger in the process, whilst also hurling verbal, racial abuse at him. It wasn't long after the London bombings, so you can imagine what was said. My dad was also an electrician in Russell Square at the time, close to one of the blasts. The officer didn't react, probably knowing I was watching the commotion from my room or the fact he was a decent human being. My dad was convicted of multiple offenses against a police officer as well as a hate crime. The only silver lining was as my dad was being sentenced, the prosecutor was a black man who casually read out the testimony of the arresting officer of what my dad said that night. The prosecutor could barely keep a straight face, watching my dad hold his head in shame, dressed in plastic overalls because he thought stuffing his clothes down the toilet of his jail cell and flooding the place would be funny. He got community service, probation, and was required to attend rehab. He relapsed a few years ago and can barely walk or talk because of multiple strokes from continued alcohol dependency. The people responsible for protecting me from my dad were people of color. That sure as hell changes your perspective on things, even if you have the slightest ignorance towards another race. The people responsible for protecting me from my dad were people of color. The white cops never did a damn thing when my dad was having his rage episodes. I have seen him go on wild rampages that if I described you'd think I'd have made up. And whenever the cops were involved, I was the one taken away and shoved in a lifeless box with a metal table for a bed for 12 hours. Me, the 17-year-old, getting my A beaten nearly nightly by my alcoholic unemployed father. My favorite story of my father's crap was the night he told 911 dispatch I had a gun to his head and was threatening to kill him execution style. I didn't buy my first gun until I was 22. They tore my room up and then I got stuck with a lawsuit from the landlord for it because I was 17 when this one happened. I never went back when they let me go the next morning. I spent the next 2 years homeless. I wish someone would have pulled me out of there, given me help. So many people who just turned their backs on me, treated me like I was the problem. I needed some brain bleach after this. So enjoy this video of my cat on a bike ride. I never made the choice really to be racist, but I grew up in South Mississippi and my family wasn't overtly racist, but they were the kind to say racist things behind closed doors and didn't allow us to watch TV shows such as The Cosby Show or Fresh Prince, and definitely no rap music in the house. I absolutely fell in love with a lot of black artists in the early 90s. I loved the hip hop scene at the time and holy sh, Fresh Prince was the best sitcom on television. I played football with 80% black guys and worked at Popeye's Chicken with over half the staff being black. I guess you can say my own real world exposure despite their attempt to shelter me changed me. I cringe at some of the vernacular I used in my early youth, as the N-word was the same as black in my house. I literally was not raised to know that was a bad word. I'm glad that from the age of maybe 12 on I learned to love all people on my own. I was a nice white racist. I think a big part of it was that I grew up in a very white town, so the only information I got about other cultures was from TV and other media. I never said a racial slur and never thought of myself as racist. I was perfectly nice to anybody I met, but I would definitely hold my purse a little closer if a black or Latino man was passing me. I believed cliches about other races. I generally thought of the POC folks I met as the exceptions to the cliches about their people. Then I started seriously dating an Asian man. I'd never dated a non-white person before. I was shocked by how frequently we had people give us double takes when holding hands in public. We were on a road trip and stopped by Walmart for some snacks. It was the first time I've really felt unsafe. People were glaring at us simply because we were a mixed race couple. We split up in that Walmart for safety. I asked him if that's how he always felt in small towns and he laughed and said that how he always felt in the town I had grown up into. It was a medium-sized college town. That was my big wake-up call. I started analyzing my thinking. I started catching myself thinking in stereotypes. I started noticing when I was being racist and started trying harder to be less racist. I'm not perfect. I'm still a little awkward around black people. I still catch myself thinking racist thoughts, but I think I'm better than I was a few years ago. Eater, I married the Asian boyfriend. If you marry the person who helps you be the best version of yourself.